Good day, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. And this has been a really rich conference today. And our last but not least presentation is by Jörn Kroll, a longtime practitioner. Jörn attended the University of Göttingen in Germany and has a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. He's a member of the APPA, of the Jaspers Society of North America, of the American Philosophical Association, the Institute for Noetic Sciences, Scientific and Medical Network in London, student of the Diamond Approach, a longtime philosophical practitioner with a focus on facilitating embodied transformation. And today, Jörn's going to talk to us about Jaspers' philosophy of Existenz and its manifold value for philosophical practice. So welcome, Jörn. I will load up the show, and the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Okay, Lou, can you advance to the next slide? Okay, yeah, today's I want to present the Karl Jaspers and introduce Karl Jaspers MD to those who are not familiar with his work. I want to indicate the relevance, particularly to philosophical practice, and sort of giving a sense of the wide range of his philosophizing. And I'm emphasizing here on the slide the gerund philosophizing, because it is very important for him to say and conceive of his philosophy as an activity. And he encourages us also to think of philosophy not so much as an edifice or something in writing, but as an inner activity. That is actually, he defines thinking, an inner activity. Next, please. So my main topics are, I give a quick general characterization of his work, and then follow up with a short biographical sketch of Jaspers. Then I'll get a little bit more into the sort of essence of his philosophizing, contrasting mundane existence versus existence. And the last main topic is the centrality of communication for Karl Jaspers and for his philosophizing. Next, please. So what is Jaspers' philosophizing? As I understand it, at least, it is not a system like Hegel's system of philosophy or Aristotle's philosophy system. It's also not an assembly of doctrines, because, as you would see, having a specific doctrine and sort of insisting on its value and truth is problematic in Jaspers' point of view. And it's not a system of techniques, so or philosophical or psychological techniques. Maybe a best way of describing it in general terms, philosophizing is an open-ended activity for self-transformation. So his philosophy wants to help us transform ourselves. Next, please. Maybe this quote sums up the general thrust of his philosophizing. The ultimate point of all philosophical thought is philosophical life. what the individual does in the inner action that lets him be himself. So even though Jaspers was an academic, even though he was trained in medicine, but most of his life was a philosophy professor. But in contrast to many philosophy professors, he did not seem to think that writing and teaching philosophy is the most important thing in philosophy, but leading a philosophical life. And all his writing is geared to that, even though when you when you read, especially his thick volumes he wrote, you get a sense of the academic depth, but he reminds you very often that whatever he writes is for your edification. So it has always a pragmatic, a practical application. And here in this quote, he states it quite directly. Sometimes I will have quotes where he basically uses the masculine pronoun, he. That's due to the fact that in German, the word for human being is der Mensch, which is masculine. Therefore, the translators, using the masculine pronoun as well. So, but der Mensch is is to be described or recalled here, not necessarily a male being. Okay, next, please. So a brief biographical sketch. Karl Jaspers was born in northern Germany, Oldenburg, and he first studied law. He was quite interested and also intrigued by Max Weber. His father, I think he was, a banker, so didn't follow neither law nor the banking business, and went into medicine, and he specialized in psychiatry. He became a professor of psychology in 1916 based on his 2-volume book on the methodology in psychopathology. And the textbook, I think it came out 1912 or 1913, is still used today, not for the actual concrete medical knowledge, but for the methodology he uses and he proposes in that work. Then he wrote a book, Psychology of Worldviews, and that earned him a professorship, again, also at the University of Heidelberg. But at the consternation of his philosophical colleagues, they were thinking, well, how can this medical man, as good as he may be in his field, suddenly, teach with us philosophy? What does he know about philosophy? So they were angry, and so some friction began from the start when he became professor of philosophy in Heidelberg, maybe, yeah. In 1937, the Nazis dismissed his professorship and prohibited him from publishing. This was not due to anything he may have written which got him in trouble with the Nazis. The fact that his wife, Gertrude Meyer, was Jewish, that was enough for him to lose his professorship and the prohibition to publish. Next, please. Yeah, Karl Jaspers and his wife, Gertrude Meyer. You see here on the screen. Next, please. Yeah, in the early 30s, he wrote his 3-volume book, Philosophy, which is perhaps his most important or famous work. Like several others of his major works, reaches up to 1,000 pages in total, which is certainly the case here for his philosophy. After World War II, he was reinstalled as professor of philosophy and actually became president of the University of Heidelberg. In 1947, he published a book, Von der Wahrheit, the best translation would be Of Truth, which, as far as I know, has never been translated into English. It has also over 1,000 pages. In 1948, he switched universities, became professor in Basel, Switzerland, which he held this professorship until 1961, when he retired from active teaching. And in 1959, he was actually proposed for the position of president of West Germany. The president in Germany is a ceremonial figure. It's head of state rather than head of government. I don't know the details why he wasn't selected. I think he was proposed without him actually seeking the position. He had many philosophical projects still he wanted to complete, so I think it was not his wish. In 1965, he got the International Peace Prize. Next, please. Here you see the couple in later years, Gertrude and Kroll. I like the photo. On many photos, Karl Jaspers is not smiling. He looks too stern, and here it's wonderful to see them both laughing. Thank you. Yeah, next one. Next one, please. Hannah Arendt is probably his most famous, or internationally most famous student. Of course, as you may know, she studied first with Martin Heidegger and then went to Heidelberg and studied basically with Karl Jaspers and wrote her dissertation also with or under him. She was born also in northern Germany, actually in the same state, or Lower Saxony. And for those of you who don't know some of her writings, The Origin of Totalitarianism, The Human Condition, or Eichmann in Jerusalem. Next, please. So now to a little bit more into the substance of my presentation. Existential philosophy defined. So a rough definition by him. As you can see, I use lots of quotes. I want to let Karl Jaspers speak sort of for himself as much as possible. Existential philosophy is a present conception of possibilities for a transcendently related humanity. It's an abstract kind of definition of what he wants to do. I think the rest of the presentation will make it clearer what he actually means with transcendently related humanity. Next, please. For him, it is very important to distinguish between two different modes of being human. The one on the left column here is existence, which is basically mundane existence. When we focus on physical, well-being, or even more basic, just survival. So we may be concerned with getting ahead or getting along. And existence is a mode of being which is predominantly pragmatic and focused on material or orientation. In the German texts, existence is not used. Jaspers uses the word Dasein, which means just being there. And so both of these terms are actually used in the English translations. And the translator, especially in the main philosophy book called Philosophy by Jaspers, is the capitalized Existenz to distinguish it from mere existence, from merely getting by or doing daily pragmatic things. So existence is concerned with intrinsic, selfhood, but it's not selfhood that is totally absorbed with being oneself. It is also a being in community with others. So communication is very important for Jaspers. For him, philosophy is basically a communication on central important things. And what really distinguishes existence from mundane existence is that existence is related to transcendence. Next, please. A description, not necessarily really a definition of existence. I found this one particularly helpful. Existence is a never objectified source of my thoughts and actions. It is that whereof I speak in trains of thought that involve no cognition. I think what he means, no particular focus on concrete objects. Existence is what relates to itself and thus to its transcendence. Next, please. Yeah, that definitely, opens up the question, what is transcendence? When it is so important, in fact, central to what he means by existence. So transcendence is definitely not really definable because it is not any kind of an objective being. It's not anything you can point to or sometimes Jaspers depending on the context, uses the term, its transcendence is the completely other. In other contexts, he implies or says directly by what he means by transcendence is the divine, Godhead, or directly God. An interesting quote in that context regarding sort of our independence or feeling feeling independence. I think it's a very remarkable one. He says, the only independence possible for us is dependence on transcendence. So dependence on all the implications, what transcendence actually, could mean, given the context, and especially what we personally experience as transcendence. Next, please. So even this is not certainly not a definition, but it is sort of an indirect way of possibly describing what he means by transcendence. Transcendence is a being that never becomes world, but that speaks through the being that is in the world. There is transcendence only if the world does not consist only of itself, but points to itself. If the world is everything, then there is no transcendence. But if there is transcendence, perhaps there is something in the world's being that points to it. Next, please. So what is very important for Jaspers is keeping world and transcendence together. And he has a phrase for it, which is, immanent transcendence. And this phrase, immanent transcendence, points to the fact that we should neither focus just on mundane living or being lost sort of in other worldliness, but keeping them together. So this concept of immanent transcendence transcends both one-sided extremes and combines both extremes, world on one hand, transcendence on the other, on a higher inclusive level, where they are both there, but they are joined and not separate. Next, please. Yeah, this simple graph may visually represent what Jaspers means by immanent transcendence. You see here the opposition or even combat sometimes between world or worldly existence and transcendence. But in existence, both poles or both polarities are present. Next, please. Here maybe some characteristics of or features of immanent transcendence, because it consists of those both poles. When immanent transcendence is there, it is in an in-between state. Um, that's the way I feel. An in-between state, and because you are sort of between those two poles, there is a kind of soaring or gliding awareness, a kind of floating. And this gliding awareness has the qualities that makes you capable of losing fixations or rigid identifications on anything. You may still have firm beliefs and firm positions on something, but you have freedom from them. You are not fixed to them, and you don't rigidly identify with them. Next, next, please. With respect to your holding opposites together, Jasper says, yeah, my way of relating to the world remains contradictory. It is in holding opposites together that I come to be. My self-being is real only if it appears to me in the objectivity of mundane being. So here you can see that he does not talk down or make fun of mundane being, because that's most of the reality we are living in. On the other hand, he recommends that we hold both poles, world and transcendence, together. And in holding both opposites together, that we come to be, ourselves. Next, please. As I mentioned, communication is very important for him. That's the way he conceives, actually, of his philosophizing. What is not realized in communication is not yet. The truth begins with two. Next, please. So as a part of this practical philosophy of Jaspers, he conceives of philosophizing in a way as a symphony, to speak. True philosophical discussion is a symphilosophizing, which in the medium of impersonal contents allows existence to touch and unlock other existence. So I really like this particular quote where he really makes clear philosophizing is an interpersonal or a group activity, not just an individual thinking. Of course, it is that as well and has to be, but it is a communal activity. I've not seen anything like this in so-called academic philosophers, which Jaspers definitely is as well. Next slide, please. occasionally, Jaspers alludes to play and suggests that it is a model for philosophizing. Philosophizing as a conception and expression of thoughts is a game. To be aware of playing it is a safeguarding that will prevent any objective consolidation of our thoughts. So even if his reading and if his writing and our reading is not necessarily, playful, sometimes it's quite difficult to understand what he actually wants to say. We should ideally conceive our philosophizing as this playful activity, namely for the very reason that we also don't philosophize, that we don't cling on and hang on and identify ourselves with any particular position. So it prevents a consolidation and a hardening of our positions. Next. So now I want to say something of how the different components of Jaspers come together. On the one hand, the philosophy of existence, the importance of communication, and then the orientation to our community, of our immediate community, and then the larger community, and even the world in general as really a large, comprehensive community. You can basically say, how we deal with our community, is politics, or maybe better understood in the ancient Greek conception of, polis. So some characteristics he wants to see in us when we can realize existence, communication, and polis together. Again, uses the masculine noun, but it's standing for the human being. So he will not rigidly cling to anything he has objectified as valid. He commits himself in the situation and he finds himself in, and yet he never identifies with his situation. He feels drawn to strangeness, to opposition, to what will doubt and deny him the most. To him, mundane existence grows lucid only to reveal its true obscurity. And here you can see, especially in the third point, that he even likes, opposition, and especially in his, in his writing or in his discussion, because that will draw out clarity about his own positions. He does not want, just that people, agree with him. So the two-way aspect, or the multiple connections between presenters and listeners and vice versa, that is what is important for him, like Symphilosophizing. And the last quote. When these three aspects, existence, communication, and community come together, then what appears typically in our everyday being, what appears as mundane existence, as he says, becomes lucid and reveals its true obscurity. So that in that sense, our regular mundane existence shows its mystery, shows its strangeness and its wonder. Next slide. So this love for challenge, this love for lively engagement and tossing different ideas around is very important for him in his political writings, even though here the quote is definitely not from one of his political writings. He conceives of politics as a loving struggle, or at least hopes that political opposition or political fights, political hostility can be transformed into what he calls loving struggle or loving fight. So loving struggle is a fighting, clear-sighted love of possible existence, tackling another possible existence, questioning it, challenging it, making things hard for it. That sounds very combative. Surely it is. On the other hand, he says at the same time, this loving struggle is actually an incomparable solidarity which prevails in such a loving struggle. So maybe on the surface, it may appear, a rough fight, jostling with ideas, with points to make, and so on. But underneath all these opposing behavior and the words is a incomparable solidarity, and as long as it's there, we can go at it. It is a loving struggle. At least that is his ideal. And I think in our present United States political situation, I wish we had more of this loving struggle, or at least could transform political hostility into this loving struggle. Next. I've shown this quote before, even though it was somewhat shorter the first time. This time I have added the line which I left out. So existential philosophy is a present conception on the grounds of adopted tradition of possibilities for a transcendently related humanity. So for him, tradition is very important. He was a liberal, conservative thinker, for whom tradition, was very, very important. Cultural tradition, artistic tradition, and definitely philosophical tradition. And even even though one is not attractive to a particular kind of philosophy, for instance, it deserves, in his view, respect, and also it it is important to know that tradition, so that you are not blind. And he is really aware that we really stand on tradition, that our culture is ultimately totally dependent on on our tradition as our heritage. Next slide, please. Jaspers was a trained a medical man. Of course, he had to study natural science quite a lot, and he really likes science. But you will find in his writings sometimes critical remarks, not about science itself, but what he calls actually scientific superstition. He who takes scientific insight for knowledge of being itself, and as a whole, has succumbed to scientific superstition. So what he is against basically is when scientists extend the scope of their findings or results way beyond the typical narrow and circumscribed realm of their expertise. When they make statements, as he says, about, a whole area of knowledge, of which the particular scientific finding is just a tiny portion, but then they expand that particular finding and make it maybe a general metaphysical statement, for instance. That's what he is not liking. And also he likes to remind scientists that science changes so quickly that that modesty is a good quality of a good scientist, knowing how quickly so-called knowledge can change and can be overruled also so quickly. Next, please. Here's a good quote, or for him, psychoanalysis is Ersatz philosophy, or a substitution for a philosophy. Even though he has studied psychiatry a lot, and he was also active in psychiatry, he does not like psychoanalysis. So that's more on the the Freudian side of psychoanalysis, which he likes, which is too simplistic in his point of view. Also because it certainly, at least the Freudian version, doesn't want to have anything to do with transcendence. And that's also one reason. And I think other forms of psychoanalysis, or certainly, good psychotherapy, is something which he would not call, in this very dramatic and derogatory term, Ersatz psychology. But here you see a sort of a quote also from his philosophy, where he can where he shows that he can have a quite sharp tongue, and he definitely had also opponents of his philosophy, because he as you can see in this, in this very short quote, that he can generate enemies quite quickly, with his sharp tongue. And next, this comes also out in a longer quote, what he says about psychoanalytical presentations, especially regarding symbols. So he says, the psychological interpretations of symbols generally become a grimace of a reading of the cipher script according to an age that was without faith. Instead of elucidation and faith, fake explanation and superstition is practiced. And this, as you can see, is from his later work, 1947, Von der Wahrheit. So this is my my translation of it, or at least of this quote. And next, please. Here are a few items for sources of additional inspiration for philosophical practice. From Karl Jaspers, he was one of the pioneers in what we call today world philosophy. He wrote monographs on Kongzi, or better known as Confucius, Lao Tzu, Chuangzi, Buddha, and Nagarjuna. So he was definitely a pioneer, in that field. He was very interested in history, not only history of philosophy. And in this book, The Origin and Goal of History, he developed what is called the theory of the axial age, estimated by him around 900 to 300 BCE, which is basically the statement that in China, ancient India, and in the West, in ancient Greece, and in ancient Israel, our current world was created sort of in its seed. And that development happened pretty much at the same time in ancient China, ancient India, and in the Mediterranean basis focused on ancient Israel and ancient Greece. He was very active in writing on political issues, and especially after World War II. He got also into fights or discussions, or you could say loving struggles with theologians. And I think in particular Bultmann and Karl Barth. So in those theologians, they were all Protestant theologians he was sort of writing against. He had a problem with the attempt to demythologize theology, so to take all mythical statements, images, parables, wisdoms out of the Bible and make them really like turning them into a rational, philosophy. He considers that as a devaluation of the biblical tradition, and he wrote against that kind of attempt in Protestant theology. For him, symbols or ciphers are very important because for him they are a medium for the experience of the gliding awareness, which I have mentioned before, because the symbols and ciphers don't appeal directly to our rational, being, to rational thinking. They have an impact on our whole being, thinking and feeling, sensing, all together. And that, therefore, you can see why he also was against demythologizing, theology. It would be an impoverishment of our tradition, in his view. Next slide, please. My recommendation for people not familiar with Karl Jaspers, in my mind, here's the best introduction to Karl Jaspers and by Karl Jaspers, is a very short book called Way to Wisdom. It is a transcription of 12 radio lectures he gave in Basel in 1950. I think, so if I had to recommend one book by Karl Jaspers, I would suggest this particular one. It has only 140 pages in this English translation, with some appendices, quite useful as well. But I have read this book, in the German original several times, and I find great wisdom in a very clear way described in this book. And people who are not familiar with philosophy can read this and get much out of it for their own life. You don't have to be trained in philosophy to read and understand it. Next, please. So this is my final quote, and philosophical faith for him is a venture in radical openness or in radical communication. Philosophy awakens, makes attentive, indicates ways, prepares, allows to mature, to experience the utmost. Thank you very much.